What if I told you the world map you see today isn't natural? It was drawn by people who didn't even live there. And even the map itself is a lie. Africa, for example, is nearly twice the size it's shown. Those lines and proportions were designed to make empires look bigger and everyone else smaller. Yet those same lines still control how billions of us live, fight, and even think. This is the story of how old empires never really died. They just changed shape. When you look at a map of Africa or the Middle East, you'll notice something strange. The borders look too straight. That's because they were drawn by European powers sitting around a table in 1884 during something called the Berlin Conference. They didn't ask the people living there, they just grabbed a ruler and divided entire nations. Tribes, families, and cultures that had lived together for centuries were suddenly split apart, while others who had nothing in common were forced to share one country. That's why even today, many conflicts trace back to those lines made by men who never set foot there. But it wasn't just borders they controlled, it was money, and that control never really ended. Colonialism wasn't just about land, it was about profit. When European powers sailed across the world, they didn't come for adventure, they came for resources. They took Africa's gold and diamonds, Asia's spices and tea, and the Middle East's oil. They built ports, mines, and railroads, but not for the people living there. Those railways weren't designed to connect towns, they were built to connect mines to ships. Everything flowed one way, out. In the Congo, Belgium took so much rubber and ivory that millions of Africans died under forced labor just so Europe could have car tires and piano keys. In India, Britain turned one of the richest civilizations on Earth into a supplier of cheap cotton, while British factories made fortunes selling clothes back to Indians. Egypt grew cotton too, not for itself, but for British textile mills in Manchester. And in the Middle East, oil was discovered, but the profits went straight to London, Paris, and later Washington. By the mid-1900s, the empire flags came down, and countries started calling themselves independent. But the money didn't stay, the system stayed the same. Today, Ghana exports cocoa, but Europe makes the chocolate. Nigeria exports crude oil, but imports gasoline because it has almost no refineries. And the Democratic Republic of Congo, which holds over 70% of the world's cobalt, the metal that powers your phone, still remains one of the poorest nations on Earth. Colonialism changed its name. It became free trade, or aid, or investment. But the pattern is the same. Rich countries control the prices, the factories, and the technology, while poor ones provide the labor and the land. It's like the empire took off its military uniform and put on a business suit. Invisible borders replaced visible ones. Instead of soldiers, they were corporations. Instead of colonies, they were contracts. And even though the world looks free on the map, many nations are still trapped in the same economic chains that were built centuries ago. And when people lose control of their money, they start to lose something deeper, their identity. In schools, kids were taught the colonizers' language, and sometimes told their own wasn't worth speaking. In Algeria, children grew up learning French, not Arabic. In India, English became the key to education and success, while native languages were pushed aside. In many African countries, students could get punished for speaking their mother tongue in class. Local heroes were called rebels. In Kenya, freedom fighters like Dedan Kimathi were labeled terrorists by the British. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for fighting apartheid, the same man later celebrated as a global icon. Even their stories were rewritten to make colonizers look like civilizers and the colonized like savages. Even today, we sometimes think European culture equals modern, and everything else is behind. We celebrate Shakespeare, but not African poets. We call French cuisine fine dining, while local dishes are street food. This mindset was built over generations to make people admire their oppressors and doubt themselves. But that's changing. In Kenya, schools are now adding Swahili history and African literature to their curriculums. In Bolivia, children are learning Quechua and Aymara again, the languages of their ancestors. In New Zealand, the Maori language, once nearly erased, is now taught nationwide. And in the Pacific Islands, traditional navigation using stars and ocean currents, once banned by colonizers, is now taught to young sailors.
People are taking back what was stolen, not just land, but story. They're reclaiming their languages, their heroes, their pride. Because when people remember who they are, they stop believing they were ever lesser. And when stories come back to life, people begin to see who really holds the power.
Here's the twist. Even though empires left, the power structures they built stayed behind. Big global banks, trade systems, and even the UN, most of them were designed when Europe ruled the world. That's why institutions like the IMF and World Bank often favor wealthy nations, and why the UN Security Council still gives more power to 5 countries, mostly Western ones. But the Global South is pushing back. Africa is building its own trade zones through the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCTA. In Latin America, alliances like CELAC and ALBA are forming without Western control. In Asia, countries like Indonesia and Malaysia are renegotiating mining and palm oil deals to protect their land and workers. The message is clear: the world is tired of being managed like a colony. So what happens when the world finally realizes it's still living in someone else's system?
Maybe the maps we see today are just temporary, because new movements are redrawing them, not with borders, but with ideas. Ideas of justice, equality, and sovereignty. Colonialism might have started centuries ago, but its echo is still here, in every border conflict, every unfair trade, every voice still fighting to be heard. And maybe, just maybe, the next generation won't just live on the map, they'll rewrite it. Because the story of the world isn't finished, it's still being written by people like you. If you believe it's time to change the map, to change the system, then let this video travel. Leave a comment, hit like, and share it forward, so more people can see how deep the lines really go.